Picture a summer day in the 1960s, kids riding bikes without helmets, running barefoot through sprinklers, and clutching toys that parents assumed were harmless. The air buzzed with the sound of lawnmowers, transistor radios, and the distant melody of the ice cream truck. Children darted in and out of yards, inventing games, building forts, and testing the limits of freedom that came with long, unsupervised afternoons. To parents, these moments looked idyllic. Toys were symbols of joy, handed over on birthdays, holidays, or after a good report card. They carried the promise of fun and innocence, wrapped in colorful packaging and cheerful jingles. What no one stopped to consider was how much danger might have been hiding in plain sight. Play culture in the 1960s was defined by trust in toy companies, trust in advertising, and trust in the idea that if it was sold in a store, it must be safe. Parents didn't study warning labels or safety guidelines. There were few to read. A television commercial showing smiling children was often enough to convince a family that a toy was harmless. In truth, many toys reached the shelves with little testing and even less oversight, turning backyards and living rooms into places where fun and risk were never far apart. Independence was part of the appeal. Children were expected to entertain themselves, and toys became tools for adventure. A shiny new set of lawn darts, a chemistry kit, or a BB gun wasn't seen as dangerous. It was a way to learn, to toughen up, or to join the ranks of big kids. Scraped knees, singed fingers, or a trip to the emergency room were brushed off as part of growing up. Accidents weren't unusual, but they rarely sparked outrage. Instead, they were folded into the narrative of childhood resilience, a reflection of the belief that kids would figure things out as they went along. Looking back now, it's startling to see how casual those attitudes were. Toys that would never pass safety standards today once sat proudly beneath Christmas trees or filled birthday party goodie bags. They mirrored the era's optimism and its blind spots, the faith in science, the thrill of progress, and the cultural embrace of independence over caution. For many boomers, the smell of plastic toys warming in the sun or the weight of a toy gun in hand is still bound up with happy memories, even though those very objects sometimes caused harm. Toys of the 1960s remind us that childhood was never as safe as it looked in family photo albums. They capture both the freedom and the fragility of a time when parents assumed innocence meant protection. What children held in their hands reflected not just the products of a booming post-war economy, but the values and vulnerabilities of an entire generation. But behind the smiles and jingling ice cream trucks, some toys came with risks nobody questioned at the time. What could possibly go wrong with giving kids miniature rockets, cap guns, and fireworks in a box? Plenty. The 1960s were a decade when explosive fun wasn't just a figure of speech, it was a marketing promise. Parents thought they were giving their children adventure, a taste of independence, and a way to imitate the excitement they saw on television or in the movies. In reality, they were often handing over toys that could burn, injure, or even land a child in the emergency room. Cap guns were among the most popular toys of the time, sold in countless variations. Made to look startlingly realistic, many came with paper rolls or plastic rings of tiny gunpowder caps that snapped with a sharp crack when the trigger was pulled. Some cartridges were even designed to release a faint smell of smoke, imitating the real thing. For kids, it was thrilling. For parents, it was harmless play. But the loud pops left burns on small fingers, and the toy's realistic appearance sometimes led to misunderstandings far more dangerous than the play itself. Toy rockets brought another layer of excitement and risk. Miniature launch kits promised the thrill of flight, allowing kids to send projectiles soaring into the air. But these toys often relied on flammable materials or small-scale explosives. Instructions were vague, safety measures minimal, and accidents inevitable. A miscalculated launch could singe hair, burn skin, or shatter windows. Yet for a generation raised on the space race, these toys symbolize progress and daring. The risk was part of the fun. Chemistry kits only added to the explosive culture. Marketed as educational, they included chemicals that today would never be allowed in a child's hands. Flammable powders, acids, and even uranium ore samples found their way into these boxes. Parents encouraged boys especially to experiment, mix, and explore, often with little understanding of the dangers. Fires started in garages and basements, smoke-filled kitchens, and kids learned firsthand how quickly science could turn volatile. Underlying it all was the spirit of the 1960s, a culture that celebrated thrill-seeking, boldness, and experimentation. Firecrackers were sold freely, often to children with little concern for injury. Noise and sparks filled summer nights, and burns or cuts were brushed off as just part of childhood. Risk was seen as a character-building experience rather than something to fear. Today, it's almost unthinkable that children once played with miniature explosives sold as toys. Yet for boomers, those crackles, bangs, and flashes were stitched into the soundtrack of youth. They reflected not just the toys themselves, but the larger culture of adventure and danger woven into everyday play. And sometimes, the danger wasn't about sparks or explosions. It came from the sharp edges of innocent outdoor fun. It looked like a simple family game. A set of weighted darts, a plastic ring, and the promise of backyard fun. Lawn darts, often sold under the name Jarts, were marketed as the perfect way to bring families together outdoors. The rules were simple. Toss the darts into the circle, score points, and enjoy an afternoon in the sun. On the surface, it seemed no more dangerous than horseshoes or croquet, two other popular backyard games of the era. But hidden beneath the bright packaging and smiling advertisements was a toy that blurred the line between harmless fun and serious hazard. The darts themselves were deceptively simple. Made of plastic bodies with sharp, heavy metal tips, they were designed to pierce the ground with a satisfying thud. For children, the thrill of hurling them high into the air was irresistible. The problem was gravity. What went up had to come down, and those darts often landed on more than just grass. Heads, feet, and shoulders became unintended targets. Emergency rooms across the country began reporting injuries, many of them serious, as families realized too late that their game was more like tossing around missiles. Despite the risks, lawn darts were treated as just another backyard toy throughout the 1960s. Families brought them out for barbecues, holiday gatherings, and long summer evenings. Parents often stood nearby, watching children play without fully grasping how dangerous the darts could be. The assumption was that if something was sold in a toy aisle, it must be safe. Injuries were brushed off as accidents, the price of outdoor fun, rather than signs of a flawed product. Part of the allure came from the era's culture of independence. Children were expected to play rough, take risks, and bounce back from scrapes or bruises. Lawn darts fit neatly into that mindset. They weren't seen as weapons. They were seen as tests of skill, challenges that made kids feel older and more capable. For many baby boomers, the sound of a dart sinking into the soil was part of the soundtrack of summer, right alongside the crackle of sparklers and the hum of cicadas. Looking back, lawn darts stand as one of the clearest examples of how toys could straddle the line between sport and hazard. They became infamous in later decades, with bans eventually removing them from shelves after too many serious injuries. Yet they remain an iconic symbol of 1960s play, a reminder of a time when danger wasn't always obvious, and when parents trusted games to be safer than they really were. The legacy of lawn darts lives on in memory, stories told with a mix of nostalgia and disbelief. For boomers, they capture both the carefree spirit of childhood and the risks that came with it. What seemed like an innocent backyard pastime now serves as a cautionary tale about the hidden dangers of fun. But not all dangers flew through the air. Some were tucked into the hands of every young child. In 1960s America, every child wanted to be a cowboy, a soldier, or a secret agent, and the toy industry delivered. Westerns dominated television, war movies filled theaters, and James Bond's cool confidence inspired kids across the country. Play revolved around adventure, bravery, and make-believe battles, and toy makers were quick to supply the props. Revolvers with shining silver barrels, rifles with realistic weight, and even toy machine guns lined store shelves, marketed as the must-have accessories for any child with an imagination. These toys were not subtle imitations. Many were crafted to look startlingly real, with metal finishes, wooden grips, and sound effects that echoed actual gunfire. Some even used caps to simulate smoke and the smell of gunpowder, blurring the line between fantasy and reality. Children ran through neighborhoods, pointing these toys at one another in games of cops and robbers, cowboys and outlaws, or soldiers storming imaginary battlefields. To adults, it was harmless fun, part of growing up. To children, it was empowerment, holding something that made them feel like the heroes they admired on screen. But realism carried its own risks. Reports began to surface of police mistaking toy guns for real weapons, leading to dangerous confrontations. Accidents at home also occurred, especially when families blurred the line further by allowing BB guns and pellet guns to be treated as toys. Many baby boomers can still recall the sting of a pellet on bare skin or the warnings from parents not to shoot at windows or at each other. Injuries were common, yet they were rarely framed as reasons to remove the toys from circulation. Instead, they were considered lessons learned the hard way. Culturally, these toys reflected more than just children's entertainment. They mirrored America's pride in its military, its fascination with the frontier, and its embrace of toughness as a virtue. Playing with toy guns wasn't just a pastime. It was a way for children to act out the narratives shaping the nation's identity. At the same time, it normalized weapons as part of everyday life, embedding the idea that holding a gun, even a pretend one, was a natural extension of childhood. Looking back, the era of toy guns captures both the innocence and the unease of the 1960s. On one hand, they symbolize imagination and the cultural icons children long to emulate. On the other, they reveal how lightly risks were taken, both in terms of physical safety and in shaping attitudes toward violence. They stand as a reminder that toys are never just toys. They are cultural mirrors, reflecting the values, fears, and dreams of the time. But danger didn't always look like a weapon. Sometimes it came disguised as creativity and learning. Parents thought chemistry kits would turn their kids into little scientists, but many learned the hard way that science can burn. In the 1960s, these sets were marketed as the perfect blend of education and fun, promising to spark curiosity and inspire the next generation of inventors. Colorful ads showed boys in white lab coats mixing mysterious liquids, surrounded by bubbling beakers and proud parents looking on. Science was the future, and toys were meant to bring that future right into the basement or garage. What they also brought, however, was a level of danger that most families never anticipated. The chemistry kits of the era weren't watered-down experiments with baking soda and vinegar. They often included real chemical acids, strong enough to cause burns, powders that ignited when mixed, and substances that released noxious fumes. Uranium ore samples even made their way into some kits, reflecting a fascination with atomic energy that overshadowed concern for safety. Children could perform experiments that produced fire, smoke, and small-scale explosions, all without much supervision. For many kids, the thrill of striking a match to heat chemicals was as exciting as it was risky. Basements and garages became makeshift laboratories, lit by a single bulb and filled with the sharp smells of chemicals. Parents rarely hovered nearby. The assumption was that this was wholesome, constructive play, better than wasting time on television or comic books. For boys in particular, the image of the young scientist was seen as both aspirational and patriotic, a nod to the space age, when America placed its hopes in science and technology to lead the way. Accidents were common, though often brushed off as lessons learned. Singed eyebrows, chemical burns, and ruined carpets were part of the price of experimentation. For every child who managed a simple color change in a test tube, another learned the hard way that curiosity could literally go up in smoke. Yet these mishaps rarely dimmed the enthusiasm for science kits. They represented not only fun, but also the optimism of an era that believed discovery was always worth the risk. Looking back, these toys reveal how much faith the 1960s placed in progress. Science was seen as the solution to every problem, and exposing children to its power was considered essential. Safety standards hadn't yet caught up, and the hazards built into these sets remind us how casually risk was accepted. To baby boomers, the smell of sulfur or the fizz of a reaction in a test tube still triggers memories of excitement, even if it sometimes came with scars. The legacy of these toys lies in both their wonder and their danger. They reflect an era when the future felt limitless, when even play carried the promise of discovery. But they also serve as a cautionary tale, showing that not every experiment belonged in the hands of children. And if science wasn't risky enough, even the toys meant for speed and motion carried hidden dangers. From roller skates to go-karts, the 1960s gave kids plenty of ways to race and plenty of ways to get hurt. Speed was freedom, and for a generation growing up in sprawling suburbs and wide-open neighborhoods, the thrill of motion was irresistible. Parents encouraged children to play outside, to stay active, to burn energy in the fresh air. What they didn't always realize was that the toys designed for speed often came with sharp edges, weak brakes, and almost no safety protections. For baby boomers, the excitement of going fast often ended with scrapes, bruises, or worse. Roller skates were one of the most iconic toys of the era. The clunky metal versions strapped directly onto shoes with leather buckles, often loosening as kids sped down sidewalks. There were no helmets, no wrist guards, no knee pads, only concrete and gravel waiting to meet bare skin. Wobbly wheels sent children tumbling, and falls were almost guaranteed. Yet, in the spirit of the times, those falls weren't seen as failures. They were part of the fun rites of passage that left scars as souvenirs. Go-karts offered even greater thrills. Many were homemade, built from spare wood, scrap metal, and wheels salvaged from wagons or lawnmowers. These creations were often assembled by kids themselves, sometimes with a little help from a parent or older sibling. Sharp edges, weak joints, and questionable steering systems turned them into rolling hazards. Even the store-bought versions were risky, lacking the guardrails, harnesses, or brakes we take for granted today. Crashes into trees, curbs, or parked cars were common, but they rarely stopped children from climbing back in for another ride. Trampolines became another craze. Marketed as backyard fun for the whole family, they were sold without nets, enclosures, or padding. Children bounced high into the air, often colliding mid-jump or landing on the hard ground below. Broken bones, sprains, and concussions followed, but the thrill of bouncing outweighed the fear. Parents watched from lawn chairs, treating injuries as an inevitable part of play rather than a reason to ban the toy. Even bicycles, one of the most enduring childhood staples, carried hidden dangers. Helmets were virtually unheard of, and protective gear was almost non-existent. Kids raced through neighborhoods, skidded into turns, and rode double on banana seats, all without a thought for safety. Falls meant scrapes and bruises, sometimes worse, but they were brushed off with a bandage and a reminder to be more careful next time. What these toys reveal is a cultural mindset that places excitement above caution. The scrapes and scars of childhood were worn like badges of honor, proof of resilience and toughness. Speed symbolized independence, and the risks were accepted as part of growing up. Looking back, it's easy to see how dangerous these activities really were. But for baby boomers, the memory of racing down a hill on skates, bouncing high on a trampoline, or flying in a go-kart is tied to a sense of freedom that defined their generation. But sometimes, the most dangerous gadgets weren't fast at all. They were sitting quietly on bedroom shelves. Not every hazard was loud or flashy. Some toys carried dangers parents didn't notice until it was too late. The 1960s were filled with toys that looked bright, colorful, and innocent on the surface, but beneath the paint and plastic lurked threats that weren't always obvious. Unlike rockets that exploded or trampolines that sent children flying, these dangers were quiet, creeping, and hidden in the very materials that made the toys so appealing. One of the most common risks came from small toy parts. Dolls with detachable accessories, cars with tiny wheels, and building sets with little pieces were popular across the decade. To adults, they seemed harmless. To toddlers and younger siblings, they were choking hazards waiting to happen. Accidents occurred when children put parts in their mouths, yet many families saw them as tragic flukes rather than design flaws. There were few warning labels and almost no guidance from manufacturers about age restrictions. Parents assumed toys were safe if they were sold in stores, not realizing the dangers until it was too late. Paint itself carried another hidden threat. Many toys of the era were coated in lead-based paint, giving them their bright colors and shiny finishes. Children touched these surfaces daily, chewing on blocks, rattles, or doll hands without anyone suspecting the harm. Lead exposure is now known to cause developmental problems and long-term health issues. But in the 1960s, it was an invisible hazard. For baby boomers, the toys that brought joy may also have carried unseen consequences. Even the plastics used in toys weren't always safe. Cheaply made materials sometimes contained chemicals that cracked, splintered, or broke into sharp edges. Inexpensive imports, often produced with little regulation, flooded American markets. Parents bought them eagerly, glad to give their children affordable fun, without asking too many questions about how they were made. Trust in manufacturers outweighed caution, and the assumption was always that if it was on a shelf, it must have passed some kind of test. These quiet risks were harder to recognize than a broken arm from a go-kart crash or a burn from a chemistry set. They didn't make noise, and they didn't leave scars right away. Instead, they reflected the broader culture of the time, a willingness to believe in progress, in companies, and the idea that childhood could be carefree without careful oversight. The dangers were hidden in plain sight, ignored because they didn't fit the image of safe, happy play that parents wanted to believe in. Looking back, the silent threats of 1960s toys are just as shocking as the more dramatic accidents. They remind us that danger doesn't always come from fire, speed, or sharp edges. Sometimes it comes from the quiet details, the paint, the plastic, the parts too small for little hands. And yet, the risks didn't stop kids from loving their toys because imagination mattered more than safety. For kids, the dangers didn't matter. What mattered was the thrill of pretending, building, and exploring. The 1960s were a decade when imagination ruled playtime, and children accepted risk as the cost of adventure. A chemistry set wasn't just glass tubes and powders. It was a chance to feel like a real scientist mixing secret potions. A BB gun wasn't just a toy. It was a doorway into the world of cowboys, soldiers, and protectors. Toy rockets, lawn darts, and trampolines carried dangers parents understood on some level, but the joy of independence often outweighed the fear. Childhood was about trying, testing, and sometimes failing, and toys gave kids the tools to do just that. The accidents were almost expected. Cuts, burns, bruises, and broken bones weren't seen as tragedies, they were part of growing up. A trip to the emergency room was followed by a story retold with pride, a memory etched into the fabric of a childhood that was less supervised and less shielded than today. Parents patched wounds, warned kids to be more careful, and then let them go back outside. The risks didn't stop playing. They shaped it. For many baby boomers, those scars became badges of honor. This attitude reflected more than just toys. It reflected the culture of the time. Parents believed in resilience, in teaching toughness, and in letting children test boundaries on their own. A scraped knee or a burnt finger was considered a lesson, not a failure. Toys were tools for independence, not padded experiences designed for total safety. Childhood was rougher around the edges, but also freer, less restrained by constant oversight. Nostalgia plays a big role in how boomers remember these toys. The glow of a rocket launch at dusk, the satisfying crack of a cap gun, the bounce of a trampoline under bare feet, these memories endure long after the pain of the accidents has faded. For many, the sense of freedom and imagination mattered far more than the risks. The toys may have been dangerous, but they also encouraged creativity, bravery, and play that was wide open. Looking back, there's a bittersweet quality to it all. The risks are impossible to ignore, yet so are the joys. The balance between danger and delight defined childhood in the 1960s, leaving behind stories that sound reckless today but felt natural at the time. The toys reflected not only the optimism of parents, but also a cultural belief that childhood was meant to be lived boldly, not cautiously. But today, looking back, those gadgets say as much about America as they do about childhood. They may seem shocking now, but these toys shaped a generation that learned through both play and risk. The children of the 1960s grew up in a world where imagination stretched farther than caution, where freedom mattered more than rules, and where toys weren't just objects but symbols of the era itself. Each one, whether a BB gun, a set of lawn darts, or a chemistry kit, was a kind of time capsule, reflecting the culture, optimism, and blind spots of its moment in history. These toys carried a dual legacy. On one hand, they gave children the space to dream big, to experiment, to test limits, and to create adventures that defined their sense of independence. On the other hand, they carried risks that today would feel unacceptable, exposing children to dangers that were invisible to parents who trusted too much in manufacturers and tradition. That balance between freedom and safety sits at the heart of how the baby boomers remember their childhood, both with nostalgia and with an awareness of how different life has become. Over the decades, much has changed. Toy safety laws and regulations now shape every step of design and production. Warning labels are everywhere. Choking hazards are flagged, and toxic materials are banned. Parents are more cautious, and plays become more structured, more supervised, and more shielded from harm. Childhood today may be safer, but it is also less wild, less open-ended, less filled with the reckless independence that once defined growing up in the 1960s. What has vanished is that freedom to play with danger, the idea that risk was a natural part of childhood. What remains is the memory of how it felt, the rush of speed on skates, the spark of firecrackers, the thrill of a toy gun battle, or the awe of mixing chemicals that fizzed and smoked. For baby boomers, those memories aren't defined only by the danger, but by the sense of resilience that came from surviving it. There is nostalgia in recalling a time of fewer rules, when the world outside the front door seemed like a playground waiting to be explored. But there is also gratitude for the progress that has protected later generations from the same hidden dangers. In the end, those toys taught lessons not only through fun, but through risk, lessons of toughness, creativity, and caution, hard-earned through play. The toys that shocked 1960s America remind us that childhood is always a reflection of its time. For the boomers, it was a childhood shaped by both freedom and hazard, one that left behind stories, scars, and a sense of resilience that still lingers today. Which of these dangerous toys do you remember most? Share your memories in the comments below.